Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. For this episode, I spoke to Jacqueline Gill. Jacqueline is a paleoecologist and biogeographer, bringing, as she says, the perspectives of space and time to bear on questions in ecology and global change science. Jacqueline has studied extinction and climate change and is honestly one of the best science communicators I've come across in this space. In this episode, we talk about how best to communicate dire environmental challenges without hyper-catastrophizing, and how podcasting is making it easier and healthier to have honest, compelling conversations about science and all sorts of things. Jacqueline Gill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So I've really been looking forward to having you on the show. You were at our Breakthrough Dialogue last year talking about species extinction. I followed your work for a number of years. But as always with me, there was a tweet of yours that jumped out to me that I really wanted to start with. So a couple weeks ago, you were talking about the sort of conversation around species extinction, and you wrote, quote, "There is a lot of space between everything is fine and we're doomed. That space is our greatest asset in protecting this incredible planet." So I wanted to start there and ask, how do we do this? Sort of, how do we operate in that space? How do we think about that space? How do we think about and study and communicate the direness of environmental problems like extinction, like climate change, without hyper-catastrophizing or without becoming too complacent?
That is, to start off with a cliche, is the $1 million question. It might even be a $10 million question. It's, I think the first thing we do is we acknowledge that space exists. And that's been tremendously difficult to do, not only in terms of just how we're navigating the general kind of climate and environmental angst, but also just if you think about the decades of scientists who have been trying to get people to acknowledge that we're facing these environmental challenges, both in terms of climate change and extinction and threats to biodiversity. And for a long time, it sort of felt like we were out in the wilderness, just, the lone voice, screaming for someone to please listen to us, that this is something we need to pay attention to so we can take action. And then I felt like just in the last year or so, there's been this tremendous shift where suddenly, at least from my perspective as a scientist who works on issues like climate change and extinction, all of a sudden we don't have to get the media to get excited about these issues anymore. They've fully figured out that they can get a lot of clicks if they buy into this apocalyptic narrative. And so we've seen this sort of very rapid shift from barely covering some of these issues at all, or covering them maybe in sort of a wonky way or in more of a political way. And then suddenly now all of the narratives and the headlines are very apocalyptic, talking about we only have a few years until we've gone past a turning point for all of life on Earth, or sort of safe operating spaces for humanity, catastrophic climate change that can't be averted unless we take action within the next few years. And this very sort of doom and gloom narrative that has emerged, I think, quite recently has been really frustrating because not only in some cases does it overstate the threats, but trying to push back against that overstatement, I find myself getting pushback from people in the community who are saying, "Oh, you're just trying to downplay the situation," or "You're a shill for big oil if you're saying that this isn't a big urgent problem." And so it feels like there's no longer this breathing room. We basically either have to say, "Okay, yep, we're all doomed. It's done. That's it," or we're accused of not really portraying the problem accurately. And that to go from decades of trying to get people to have these conversations at all, and then to find out, okay, we actually can't have the conversation because we've basically just got this this sort of death notice published for planet Earth. There's no room to have a conversation there either, and so it feels like there's equally no space to have a conversation about what to do about the threats to biodiversity. And that becomes tremendously frustrating. It's like, okay, I'm glad you're all finally listening, but we still have lots of things that we can do. And there's lots of time to do those things. I'm not ready to give up on our planet yet.
I've noticed a similar thing, and I want to get back to the sort of pushback to the pushback that you talk about. But I would agree that like it has sort of heated up in the last year or so, and I wanted to ask if you have any theories as to why that happened. I don't know if it's just a sort of a new addiction to apocalyptic coverage in general. You know, we've got Donald Trump, we've got Brexit, we've got Putin. We have sort of very visual environmental devastations happening around the world. Most recently, something like the Amazon fires. Obviously, there's hurricanes and an increasing coverage of those things. But those types of problems have actually been with us for a long time, in and outside of environmental conversations. So, do you have a sense of why this is happening now?
I have some ideas, and I think some of it is a lot of people I think have had a political awakening in the last couple of years. You know, when we saw a lot of people, for example, at the Women's March or the March for Science, who had never been that politically active before. A lot of my friends and family members said, I've never been at a march in my life, and I can't believe I'm out here marching about things like women's rights or that we should have evidence-based decision making in our policies. So I think partly some people are waking up to just becoming more politically involved. I think that there's also a lot of angst and anxiety and despair because of a lot of the political situations that we're finding both here in the U.S. and again, as you mentioned, elsewhere. I mean, my friends and colleagues in the U.K. are pretty stressed out themselves. So it's not just Trump, although Trump is a large part of it. And so I think that once you hit this place or this space of deep-seated existential anxiety, it's easy to be sort of spun up by any kind of new threat or new problem. And so I think on some level we're all just a lot more anxious as a society, and so it becomes really easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel helpless, to feel powerless, especially when we know that there are these big structural barriers, voter disenfranchisement, the possibility of foreign involvement in our elections, just people feeling helpless and like they don't have a voice, elected officials who aren't having town halls or who aren't listening to their constituents. And so I think there's this combination of lots of bad things happening that are making people anxious. And then you've got people feeling helpless, like there's not a lot that we can do. And so it becomes easy to fall into a trap of pessimism or even nihilism. And on some level, I think that even becomes a sort of a coping mechanism, right? If I just stop caring or believing things can change and just give in to that despair, then, at least I don't have to fight anymore. And on some level, it takes less energy, right? But I also think that some of this responsibility lies with the media. And I understand that the media is facing tremendous challenges. People don't want to pay for news. They're expecting access to content for free if it's on the internet, right? We see subscriptions dropping, and then that's really incentivized a lot of clickbait style reporting. And we've seen this happening for years. This isn't a necessarily new phenomenon, but I think that between the sort of the general existential crises that people are going through, their sense of hopelessness. We've all been really buying into a lot of this media, like the Handmaid's Tale or The Walking Dead or other kinds of dystopic or post-apocalyptic narratives, and then you have this. I think it's like the news has figured out that they can get more clicks from people if they frame things in terms of these really extreme apocalyptic narratives in terms of the environment. And so I think then that just is this very self-reinforcing process where these stories drive our anxiety, and then we consume them. And because we're concerned citizens, because we see these things happening around us, and maybe we're experiencing climate change in new ways because as time goes on, more and more of us are more and more likely to have personal experiences of climate change, right? And so suddenly things are becoming more personal. And so I think it's a sort of perfect storm of all of these things happening at once. And, for full disclosure, I am a paleoecologist. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a social scientist. But these are my ideas based on my own experiences as a science communicator, as a citizen who's very politically aware and active, as someone who researches climate change and extinction. And this is basically my sort of pet theory,
Yeah, I mean, I
based on
agree
just
with
my
you
own
100% on
experiences.
this. It seems like we, as researchers, as communicators, as scientists, as people in the media, as policymakers, have at least some fidelity to accuracy and to scientific truth as best we understand it. I do want to sort of push you and push both of us actually a little bit on this question, though. There are a couple things that came to mind to me when I was preparing for this conversation. And the first is, sort of a representative from the media, David Wallace Wells, his new book, Uninhabitable Earth, which the whole sort of mission statement of his book is highlighting and sort of focusing on worst case scenarios. And that reminded me of another scholar who we tragically lost recently, Martin Weitzman, who sort of made his academic name in highlighting the worst case scenarios of, in this case, global climate change. So I want to at least ask you, or the two of us, ponder for a moment, what is the value of worst case scenarios and communicating those, and maybe what are the pitfalls?
Well, I think there is value in understanding or naming worst case scenarios, because it's good to have a sense of what the boundaries are, right? You want to have people need to make informed decisions. You want to be able to explore all the possible options. If I'm going in for some sort of medical procedure, I would like to be informed about what the norm is, in terms of outcomes. I actually have a surgery coming up, right? And I wanted to know, what's typical, what can I expect? And on some level, knowing the worst case scenario, might make me a little bit more anxious about the possibilities, but I also don't want to be surprised, right? I don't want to feel like I'm unprepared in the rare event that something bad does happen. And that's true for my body. It's also true for the planet. I think we can do a better job of preparing ourselves for those worst case scenarios. The problem is, though, as a society, we suck at uncertainty and we suck at probability. Even though in some areas of our lives, we deal with uncertainty and probability very well, right? But even when it comes to something like a weather forecast, or understanding the risk of getting in a car versus swimming in the ocean where there may be a shark, we don't actually do a very good job at parsing out those various realities and possibilities. And so I think what happens, both in terms of the way in which we're communicating the risks of climate change, or the threats of extinction or other environmental problems, and also sort of what we hear as a receptive community, is, we latch on the extreme rather than the understanding that, okay, well, maybe that's a 5% probability or a 2% probability. And instead, we take that worst case scenario and then that becomes reality. And there are so many problems with that.
Indeed, and I want to add some context to this conversation for our listeners by talking about the environmental problems that we're discussing. So I'll start maybe with climate change. We've heard really in the last year, as you say, much more heated rhetoric about apocalyptic outcomes, and the sort of imperative to act in, say, the next 12 years, or to respect the 1.5C climate target. So I want to sort of ask for your take on the sort of the state of the climate science today, sort of what it's telling us about the direness of the problem, and sort of how best to think about communicating that science to the public.
Oh boy, that's not a small ask. So the first thing I would say is that a lot of these sort of thresholds or tipping points are very debated in the scientific community. So, and any kind of timeline, especially something on the order of 5 to 15, 20 years, when I see people saying we have 13 years or 12 years or whatever it is to completely decarbonize, or else insert some dire prediction, I don't really see climate scientists making those kinds of statements. It's usually activists or journalists, or people sort of, again, taking the worst case scenario from some range of scenarios and then only reporting on that extreme. And so I understand the need to communicate the direness of the predicament that we're in, because you want to inspire people to act. But there are a couple of problems with I think, misrepresenting the timeline. And the first of those is that there's a lot of social science out there in terms of this, the science of communication and decision making, how to get people to be receptive to a message or how to change their behavior, because that's ultimately what we want to do, right? We don't just want to make people sad or scared. We want them to vote or change their consumer behavior or support different kinds of policies, right? But if you cause people to become so immobilized by despair or to drift into nihilism, then they end up doing, nothing. Or to kind of paraphrase or paraquote Margaret Atwood, they do worse than nothing, right? If you think that nothing can be done, then you do worse than nothing. And so we actually know that there needs to be a balance. People need to have enough hope to feel, and they need to know that there are things that they can do to feel empowered to take action, while also being reminded that there is a sense of urgency to those actions, right? So you can't just frighten people or terrify them or make them sad or anxious. You also have to give them some kind of action. And the other reason why some of these very specific or very dire worst case scenario predictions that are often passed as the norm can be harmful is that we lose credibility. I'm part of the Captain Planet generation. I grew up as a middle and high schooler in the 90s, where I grew up hearing messages about how if rates of deforestation in the rainforest continued, we wouldn't have a rainforest by the year 2000, right? And it turned out that those predictions ended up not being true, and they were often very exaggerated. And I feel like the environmental community lost some credibility, where people just decided, well, you're making things up, or these aren't really based on any kind of reality. And so then later, when some of the early messages came out about climate change, I experienced a lot of pushback from people who said, well, yeah, but I thought you said we wouldn't have any fish, or I thought you said we wouldn't have any rainforests, and I thought you said this and this. And, it sort of becomes this background chatter of doom and gloom from the environmental movement. And so then when it actually comes time to really listen to us, it's like, okay, we're actually telling the truth this time, or we're not exaggerating this time, right? And so there's this weird balance between, we do have a duty to tell the truth. We have a duty to present the full range of possibilities and to communicate uncertainty, which is tremendously hard to do. And so, when I try to make these points, people say, well, you can't just lie to people. And it's like, well, I'm not saying that we should lie. I'm actually arguing for the opposite. I'm arguing that we should tell the truth. And sometimes the truth might be that it's not as bad as is being communicated. And that is important, not only because we want people to feel empowered to act, but it's also important to maintain our credibility. And as I said in my tweet, it's important because that time that we have is an incredible asset. If people think all species on the planet are going to be doomed within 10 to 20 years, that's not enough time to really make a difference, right? We might as well be sitting here waiting for an asteroid to hit the Earth, because there would be literally nothing that we could do about that in that space of time. But if it turns out, we could actually have a better handle on which species were threatened on which timescales, then that actually gives us some tools to be able to do something about it. And again, the breathing room to do what's necessary to actually make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, your point about paralyzing anxiety, I think, is exactly right. Your point about scientific credibility is exactly right. I would just build on your last point by agreeing that the way that that you were communicating the direness of environmental problems like climate change or biodiversity loss, I do find more empowering and actually sort of more ambitious than some of the styles that emphasize worst case scenarios or act like we only have 10 years to deal with the problem. What I would hope for is a generation of scientists and researchers and scholars and activists who are actually preparing for generations worth of work in protecting the environment. We obviously the science sort of communicates that we're going to be dealing with climate change and its impacts for our lives and the lives of our children and likely grandchildren. And so that is, I think, sort of a straightforward reading of the science. But I also find it much more empowering and much more ambitious to be preparing ourselves, not necessarily for apocalypse, but for at least managing these problems or dealing with these problems in a measured but ambitious way.
I think that's a really good point. And one of the things I've started saying when I talk to people about these issues is that I think we should really be framing our actions in terms of harm reduction. And that, what I mean by that is that going forward, the sooner we act, the less harm we will do. Harm to people, harm to the planet, harm to our resilience, our societal structures, harm to species. The important thing to remember is that a zero harm scenario is not possible. And that's because harm has already happened. We are already seeing people who have lost their lives or have been displaced because of climate or other environmental issues. We know that there are species and populations that have been threatened or gone extinct due to human activities. This is something that's been going on, for decades, for centuries. And so we know that harm, it's already documented. But the sooner we act, the more harm we can prevent in the future. And I find that to be a much more helpful framework than some of this more binary thinking of everything will be okay or everything won't be okay. And that to me still conveys a sense of urgency, right? So it's not like we're kicking the can down the road by saying that we're not all doomed, right? Because the whole point is let's save as many people and species as possible. Let's save our resilient societies. Let's save our, the things that work about our social structures so that we can minimize the amount of harm going forward. And the more we do now, the less harm we will do later.
As someone who started a podcast ourselves not too long ago, I am curious to ask you, as a scientist and a communicator of science, about your experience having helped start Our Warm Regards a few years ago. I just want to ask, how would you sort of rate and describe the sort of podcasting experience in particular in the realm of science communication?
I was drawn to podcasting partly because I have a goal in my science communication where I feel like hearing people's voices in your head, so to speak, is really one of the best ways to achieve that goal. And what I'm trying to accomplish, among other things, is to just humanize scientists and the problems that we're facing, to really humanize the climate conversation. And when we started Warm Regards, there weren't really any climate podcasts that I'm aware of, and so a lot of the climate dialogue, would happen on Twitter, often in a really kind of nasty, not productive debate format. There weren't a lot of people who were necessarily talking about the personal experience, what our emotional response to climate change is, et cetera. And that dialogue has really shifted in the last few years. And that's, I think, been one of the most positive things about being a science communicator that I've just noticed in terms of just trends in our communication. But it's always been important to me to be my whole self in my science communication because of this goal of empathy. And the reason that that's important is because we know, again, to harken back to the whole science of science communication, the people who study communication for a living have told us that empathy will trump facts every time. You can give people more information. It's the so-called deficit model of science communication, that people don't make the right choices because they just don't know enough information. If you give them more information, then that's going to solve your problems. It turns out that actually isn't true. It doesn't work. People are going to be more or less receptive to your messages depending on whether you're in their in-group or not, or whether they have a personal connection with you in some way. And those personal connections, those empathic connections, it turns out are tremendously important in terms of building trust, in terms of getting people to listen to you, and again, to change their behavior, which at the end of the day is what we would like to do. And so all of the projects that I engage in as a science communicator involve this strategy of building empathy, being a person, telling personal stories. And so for me, the decision to try podcasting really came out of this goal of being able to just be more of a real person. And I did a lot of theater growing up. I was always a really big fan of Spalding Gray's monologues. He used to sit on stage and just tell these incredibly deeply personal narratives about himself. This was long before the popularity of storytelling efforts and podcasts like the Story Collider or Moth, or these other initiatives were really, really popular. And so, before the storytelling fad, and I say that in a loving way. I'm really glad that it's popular. We really had a lot of theater and monologues, and Spalding Gray did these monologues that were incredibly personal, and you just felt like you knew him. You got to know him as a person, even though obviously everything he was doing had some element of being constructed. He was on stage. It was written, but that to me was an incredibly powerful tool. And I've done a lot of improv theater and other sort of theatrical techniques where you really try to create these bridges of empathy with your audience, and that actually is the whole core of the Ellen Alda Science Communication Center. Actually, they use theater and improv techniques to try to get scientists to be more effective communicators, and so all of these kinds of tools have been really coming to the forefront in the last few years. And the thing about podcasting that's different than, say, an essay or being on Twitter or even just giving a talk to a local nature center or something like that is that you really are getting to know people over time. You're hearing their voice. I always joke that, my voice is in people's heads, right? Like you really start to feel like you get to know someone. And so again, that's really building that bridge. You hear their voice, you hear their emotions, in the tenor of their words. And also it just lets you have kind of messy and uncertain conversations in ways that other formats just don't allow, beyond the 280 characters, beyond the limitations of an op-ed or an essay. And that's something that to me is tremendously powerful. And so podcasting, I think, has become popular for a lot of those reasons, that we're seeking these authentic experiences. Conversational podcasts do that in really incredible ways. And, some people love them. Some people, prefer more scripted podcasting. But one of the reasons we really wanted to try that conversational model was, again, that we wanted people to be their whole selves. We wanted people to be messy. We wanted people to speak about their feelings around this climate conversation that had really been pretty restricted to, the sort of just the facts, ma'am, kind of reporting. Because again, when you're in this embattled domain, this space where any misstep, any wrong statement, any if you say the wrong decimal points when you're giving a quote about climate predictions, people are going to jump on you, and they're going to jump on the scientific accuracy. And I think that sense of embattlement, where you have these climate deniers who are constantly trying to undermine your scientific credibility and your authority, that doesn't create a lot of breathing room for these conversations. And there's this whole human side to being a person on this planet, this warming planet, that I think is so important to not only just it's a part of the conversation that needs to happen, but it also, again, helps build those connections with people so that they're more receptive to the actual science itself.
Yeah, it's funny, Breakthrough started when the blogosphere was still very much a thing, and a lot of that conversation has moved, as you say, to Twitter. Obviously, a lot of the other work that we do is in papers, is in reports that we publish on our website or in journals. And it wasn't actually sort of a goal of ours to sort of humanize the sort of eco-modernist conversation. When we started the podcast, we were really interested in just, giving ourselves another forum to engage with folks like you. But I found that immediately, that actually talking to people in person or at least over the phone is just a radically different experience from engaging with them on Twitter or over sort of a blog exchange or even over email. And that's true. That's been true on this show for people that I agree with and for people that I disagree with. And I have just been sort of amazed by that dynamic in a way that really shouldn't surprise me. All I'm doing is talking to another human being like I do most of the time. But just, in an age where so much of sort of think tankery and so much of civil society is on Twitter or is in blogs or is in op-ed pages or is in academic papers, there is sort of a very underappreciated value in talking to another human like they're another human.
Oh, I agree. And there are so many cases where, how many times have you been in a Twitter conversation that kind of goes sideways and you feel like you're talking past each other and you end up just saying, I wish we could continue this over beer, or, this is just too complicated for Twitter, right? And I think that just harkens back to this idea that there is not a substitute for the messiness of verbal communication. And I say messiness in a really positive way. Like I am a verbal thinker, right? You've probably picked that up from just the way that I answer these questions, right? I sometimes weave a little bit and I backtrack or take weird turns and then kind of circle around. And but that's just how I think. And I think a lot of people also think that way. There's a reason that talk therapy is really effective, right? Because, in ways that maybe journaling or just thinking and spinning your wheels in your head is not. And I think that, because the act of just getting words out helps us understand ourselves. And it also, we're a little bit more forgiving of people when we speak out loud to one another. And I also think that when you have a conversation with someone that's verbal like this, it's I'm not face to face with you, but it's pretty close, right? It's closer than if I were, tweeting or emailing with you. And I often think about the terrible things that some people say to me and to some of my colleagues online. And I think, you would never say that to me if we were face to face, right? Or if we were right here. And so when we want to disagree with each other or try to understand each other, I think, because we're such a social species, we're such a storytelling species, I think having the ability to communicate in a more direct way, I think facilitates some of that, helps us get through that messiness together. And again, also we have better social norms for, I'm going to put face-to-face communication here in scare quotes, because obviously, we're on two different coasts, but, compared to something like, the internet, where we have this extra barrier between us. I think that we just have better social norms for how to talk to one another, either on the phone or face to face, versus on the sort of nameless or faceless internet experience, where that I think just breeds more, just more nastiness. And so when you want to have a conversation where you might have disagreement or you might be coming from different perspectives, set yourself up for success, right? Like, I would love to be able to have more of those kinds of conversations. And the only real way that I think I would ever do that is sort of in person, or the sort of quasi in-person space of podcasting.
I didn't actually expect to be ever more inspired to keep podcasting by talking to you today, but I appreciate that. I like to close these conversations by asking our guests about something that gives you hope or optimism in the world. So whether it's sort of face-to-face communication or something in climate science, I want to ask, what do you see in the world today that gives you hope?
I would say there are two things. The first is I see a tremendous amount of energy in today's youth. They are 100% on board. They are active. They are vocal. They are empowered. They are not waiting for anyone's permission to get involved when it comes to making the world a better place. And, I think we should do everything that we can to facilitate that and to not get in the way, right? And not just to be passive, but actually to actively facilitate, to help, to join, to lift up, et cetera. And secondly, the data that's coming out of projects like the Yale Climate Communication Program give me a tremendous amount of hope, because just in the last few years, we're really seeing this shift where people are going from, agnostic or dismissive, and sort of outright hostile to the idea of climate change. They're moving more towards, concerned, even alarmed. And the numbers of the dismissive group are actually dwindling. They're getting smaller and smaller. They're the smallest contingent now. And that to me says that whatever it is that we're doing is working. It's making a difference. And I take a tremendous amount of hope from that, because for a while it sort of felt like we were just running in place and we weren't really moving that needle. And then now I think we are actually seeing a lot of a shift. So the dismissive folks are often, the sort of so-called climate skeptics or climate deniers. They're really loud. They're incredibly well organized, but they're actually not that many people. And, maybe some of them are in positions of power, but just the current election cycle, we're in the last night was the climate town hall, and we saw candidates talking about how we need to go after big oil executives and have large structural changes and stop focusing so much on the smaller personal decisions and choices that we've all been spending a lot of time and energy on for recent decades. And that shift in that dialogue, just the fact that we're having a climate town hall as part of the Democratic, nominee process, that's a huge change. That wouldn't have happened just, even an election ago. And so, I see things like that as incredibly hopeful. Like, we're moving in the right direction.
Jacqueline Gill, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcast. I want to again thank my guest, Jacqueline Gill, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.